The Beverly Hills Supper Club stood for decades as a symbol of glamour and success in northern Kentucky, perched on a wooded hillside in Southgate just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, its very name evoking Hollywood luxury and high society despite its Midwestern location. Long before the fire that would define its legacy, the club had been a destination for weddings, graduations, charity dinners, corporate banquets, and glamorous evenings of live entertainment, drawing thousands of patrons each year who arrived expecting elegance, music, laughter, and celebration. Originally established in the 1930s, the club grew gradually over time through renovations, expansions, and additions that were often improvised rather than planned, resulting in a sprawling, maze-like structure of interconnected rooms, hallways, and banquet spaces that reflected decades of changing ownership and shifting priorities. By the 1970s, the Beverly Hills Supper Club had become one of the most popular entertainment venues in the region, hosting major performers and accommodating multiple events simultaneously, a feature that made it profitable but also dangerously complex from a safety perspective. On holiday weekends in particular, the club was known to push its capacity to the limit, filling every available room with guests, tables, decorations, temporary partitions, and staff moving quickly through narrow corridors, all of it operating under the assumption that nothing would go wrong. On the evening of May 28, 1977, the club was operating at near maximum capacity as Memorial Day weekend brought an unusually large crowd. Inside the Cabaret Room, the largest and most prestigious space in the building, hundreds of guests were seated for a highly anticipated performance by singer and entertainer John Davidson, whose appearance had drawn patrons from across the region. Elsewhere in the building, wedding receptions, private banquets, and dining services were underway in rooms with names like the Zebra Room, the Viennese Room, and the Crystal Room, each decorated differently and separated by long corridors and doorways that twisted through the structure like a labyrinth. Many guests had never visited the club before and had little sense of the building's layout, relying entirely on staff and signage that was often minimal or poorly lit. As the evening progressed, laughter and music filled the air, drinks were served, meals were delivered, and few if any of the guests had reason to believe they were sitting inside a building that had become, over time, a disaster waiting to happen. Sometime shortly after 8:30 p.m., a fire began in the Zebra Room, a smaller banquet space that was not occupied at the time. The exact moment the fire ignited went unnoticed, likely because it began above the ceiling or within wall spaces, fueled by faulty electrical wiring that had not been properly installed or inspected. For several minutes, the fire smoldered unseen, growing slowly but steadily as heat built up in concealed spaces, feeding on combustible materials hidden behind walls and ceilings. When smoke was finally noticed by staff, it appeared light and manageable, the kind of problem that could be addressed with a fire extinguisher rather than a full evacuation. This initial underestimation of the danger would prove fatal. Instead of immediately calling the fire department and ordering all guests to leave, staff members attempted to locate the source of the smoke and extinguish the fire themselves, losing precious minutes as the fire continued to grow unchecked. As the fire intensified, it spread rapidly through the building's concealed spaces, moving through ceilings, hallways, and wall cavities that acted like chimneys, carrying heat and smoke toward other parts of the club. By the time flames were visible, the fire had already gained a foothold in multiple areas, making containment nearly impossible. Smoke began to thicken and spread into occupied rooms, but communication within the club was disorganized and inconsistent. Some guests were told there was a small problem being handled, while others were told nothing at all. In the Cabaret Room, the performance continued uninterrupted, the audience unaware that fire was advancing through the building around them. There was no automatic fire alarm system to alert everyone at once, no sprinklers to slow the fire's progress, and no central command directing a coordinated evacuation. The building relied on human judgment alone, and that judgment was delayed, fragmented, and ultimately overwhelmed. When the decision was finally made to announce the fire in the Cabaret Room, the situation had already reached a critical point. A staff member went on stage and attempted to calm the audience, initially suggesting that the evacuation was precautionary and that there was no immediate danger. Many guests rose slowly, confused rather than alarmed, gathering personal belongings and waiting for instructions rather than rushing to exits. This hesitation, combined with the sheer number of people present, created bottlenecks almost immediately. The Cabaret Room technically had multiple exits, But by the time evacuation began, 2 of those exits were already blocked by fire and thick smoke, leaving a single main exit as the only viable escape route for hundreds of people. As guests moved toward that exit, the power failed. Lights went out suddenly, plunging the room and surrounding hallways into darkness. Emergency lighting was either insufficient or non-existent, and the sudden loss of visibility caused panic to spread rapidly through the crowd. People stumbled over chairs, tables, and one another, disoriented by smoke that burned their eyes and lungs. The air grew toxic within moments as thick black smoke filled the space, making it difficult to breathe and nearly impossible to see. Some people fell and were trampled by others who could not see where they were stepping. Others became separated from friends and family, calling out names that were swallowed by the roar of fire and the screams of the crowd. Outside, fire departments from across the region responded as quickly as possible, but they were confronted with a scene of overwhelming chaos. Flames were already visible through the roof, and smoke poured from doors and windows as survivors stumbled out, many collapsing on the ground from smoke inhalation. Firefighters forced their way into the building repeatedly, navigating unfamiliar corridors in near-zero visibility, searching for trapped victims while the structure itself threatened to collapse. The layout of the club, with its multiple additions and confusing floor plan, made rescue efforts extraordinarily difficult, as firefighters struggled to locate rooms and exits while the fire continued to spread. In some areas, heat levels became so intense that rescue attempts were impossible, and firefighters were forced to retreat, knowing that people were still inside. By the time the fire was brought under control in the early hours of the morning, the full scale of the tragedy began to emerge. 165 people had lost their lives, most of them in the Cabaret Room, where smoke and heat overwhelmed them before they could reach the only usable exit. Many were found where they had collapsed, some still seated at tables, others piled near doorways that they never reached. The majority of victims died not from burns but from smoke inhalation, their lungs filled with toxic gases that rendered them unconscious within minutes. Entire families were among the dead, as were couples celebrating special occasions, employees who stayed behind to help guests escape, and performers who never made it off the stage. The aftermath of the fire sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. Investigations revealed a long list of safety failures that had turned the Beverly Hills Supper Club into a death trap. The building had exceeded its legal occupancy limits, lacked automatic fire alarms and sprinkler systems, and contained numerous code violations related to wiring, exits, and interior finishes. Many exits were poorly marked or difficult to access, and the complex layout made evacuation confusing even under normal conditions. The practice of expanding the club over time without comprehensive safety planning had created a structure that was impossible to evacuate quickly in an emergency. While no single individual was ultimately held criminally responsible, the disaster exposed systemic failures in enforcement, oversight, and the prioritization of profit over safety. In the years that followed, the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire became a turning point in fire safety regulation across the United States. Building codes were strengthened, requirements for sprinklers and alarms were expanded, and enforcement became more rigorous, particularly for large public assembly spaces. The tragedy was studied by fire safety professionals as a case study in how quickly small failures can compound into catastrophic loss of life. For the families of the victims, however, these changes came too late. Funerals followed one after another, communities mourned collectively, and survivors carried lifelong physical and emotional scars from a night that had begun as a celebration and ended in unimaginable loss. Today, the site where the Beverly Hills Supper Club once stood serves as a quiet reminder of what happened there. Memorials honor those who died, and the story continues to be told not as a tale of spectacle, but as a warning written in smoke and silence. The fire did not begin as a dramatic explosion or a sudden inferno. It began quietly, unnoticed, and underestimated, growing in the spaces no one could see until escape was no longer possible. The legacy of the Beverly Hills Supper Club is not only the lives that were lost, but the enduring lesson that safety ignored, warnings dismissed, and systems taken for granted can turn moments of joy into lasting tragedy in the span of minutes.